Hi, today I am making some peanut butter cookies, and in my mixer bowl I have 1 cup of softened butter, 1 cup of granulated sugar, and 1 cup of packed brown sugar that I've creamed together on medium speed for about 2 minutes. You can do this by hand, it's just easier for me with the mixer. And we're going to add 2 eggs to this and beat it all up together. I like to add the eggs one at a time on low, and then once they're both mixed in, I turn the mixer up to medium high and let it whip for a couple minutes till it's light and fluffy. I'm going to add a teaspoon of vanilla, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. We have a couple of new hens that are just starting to lay. And I don't know if you can tell how small this egg is. It's pretty tiny. It's not one I use in my baking. I'll fry that up for the dogs or make an omelet and add that to it. So it's pretty tiny. If you can, it's hard to tell the size. That's a large egg and that's an extra small next to it. So let's get the other ingredients added. I'm also going to add a heaping cup of peanut butter. You can use regular or you can use chunky. I don't buy chunky, I usually only buy regular. But this recipe is also good with nuts added to it, with chopped peanuts. But I don't have any, so we're going to add a cup of smooth peanut butter. Just a heaping cup. So once you've added the peanut butter, mix it all in together well. Make sure you scrape down the sides and the bottom and everything. Get it all mixed in. Use a good quality peanut butter for your cookies. You'll really taste a difference. My preference is Skippy. I think it's less sweet than the others, but whichever you prefer. Just use something that's good and not a cheap thing, because when you're baking, ingredients make a lot of a difference. You want to use good quality ingredients. So I'm going to add 3 cups of flour. I'm going to add them one at a time. It may take a little more. You want to be able to handle the dough without it sticking to your hands, so roll it into balls. It depends on the weather. Seems like when the humidity is high, you don't need as much, and to me that doesn't make sense. I think it was the opposite, but when it's dry you really need to add a little more. You may need to add up to a half cup, and I've even had to add up to a cup more. You just want to be able to roll these into balls without it totally sticking to your hand. So let's start with the 3 cups and we'll go from there. So I've added the 3 cups of flour, and I don't know if you can see, but it's still really wet. It's nowhere near enough where I could actually shape it. Even if I chilled it, it'd still be too wet. So I'm going to add another cup because it's going to probably take more than that. So we'll add the cup and see where we are from there. So I added the extra cup, and I don't know how well you can see in the bowl, but it's starting to pull away from the sides, which is what you want. And I can take and grab some and shape it in my hand without it totally sticking. Your hand's going to get a little greasy just because of the butter and the peanut butter, but the dough itself should not stick to your hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll it into balls. We'll roll it in granulated sugar, put it on our cookie sheet, and then we'll flatten it with a fork dipped in sugar. And we're going to bake these at 350. My oven is preheating. So I don't know if you can see, but the dough should pull away from the sides. And as I said, you should be able to handle it without it totally sticking. Your hands will get greasy, but it won't stick. What I've done is I've taken about a tablespoon of dough, rolled them into balls. If you've seen any of my baking videos, you know I'm a fan of parchment. It's not required, but it makes cleanup so much easier. So I rolled the balls in just some plain old white granulated sugar. I'm going to take a fork and just kind of flatten them First one way and then the other. I dip my fork in sugar. Once you've touched them, it'll start to stick to the fork. And that keeps the dough. And I'm going to flatten them all. We're going to bake them at 350. I'm going to check them at 8 minutes. They're not real big, so of course if you make them larger, which you can, they'll take a little longer, but these aren't going to be very big. I may make some larger ones. We'll see. See you in a few. So these are all flattened, ready to go in the oven. My oven's preheated to 350. My recipe says check them at 9 minutes, but I'm going to check these at 8 because they're a little smaller. So we'll see when the 8 minutes are up. And tray number 2 ready to go in the oven. You should get around 4 dozen for this, depending on how big you make them. One thing I forgot to mention, when you're measuring your flour, is to make sure that you stir it around a little bit before you... There's my timer. As I was saying, with your flour, make sure you stir it around a little bit before you measure it, because it gets packed down just sitting, and you'll wind up adding more flour than what you want. Which in this case, it wouldn't have been a bad thing, because I added more, but normally you don't want to add more than what the recipe calls for. Let's check on our cookies. So this is 8 minutes. They're still just a little bit too soft. I'm going to give them another minute. So there's the added minute. They're just a little bit firmer around the edges. The middle will still be a little soft. They'll be puffy when you pull them out, and they'll settle down a little bit. So I'm going to let these sit on the cookie sheet for 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll move them over to the cooling rack to finish cooling. Tray number 2 ready to go in. Only we'll do that one for 9 minutes. So it's been about 4 minutes, and I just moved them over to the cooling rack. You'll want to let these cool for a few more minutes before you try to eat one, because you'll burn your inside of your mouth. Even though it's hard to wait for them, they smell so good. And another thing I don't think I mentioned is be sure to let your cookie sheets cool in between batches. You never want to put any kind of dough onto a hot cookie sheet. It'll start to melt and your timing will be off with the baking. So let your cookie sheet cool for a few minutes until you can handle it, and then you can put the next round of dough. In between, I'm going to cover my cookie dough so it doesn't dry out, which it will do. So you can put plastic wrap or just throw a towel over a dish towel over it, as long as you're not getting any lint in there. And while you're waiting for the cookie sheet to cool. Batch number 2 in the oven. So 9 minutes was just perfect with these. They're a little crispy around the edges. The center is still soft and a little bit chewy, and that's the way I like my cookies. If you like your cookies a little bit crisper, bake them for at least another minute and try them then. They may need 2 minutes depending on how crisp you like your cookies, but I like mine crisp around the edges and chewy in the middle, and that's perfect. And these are delicious. So I got 4.5 dozen out of these. As I said, it'll depend on the size of them, but that's how big they wound up, with a little over a tablespoon size ball. So they're big enough. They'll stay at room temperature in a covered container for a couple of days if they last that long at your house. A bunch of these will go to work with hubby tomorrow, and most of the rest will go in the freezer so mama doesn't eat them all. So one thing is my downfall, and that is cookies. They are very good cookies if you like peanut butter. And we like peanut butter. Even the dogs like peanut butter. Tasty stuff. I hope you give them a try. So I got 4.5 dozen out of these. As I said, it'll depend on the size of them, but that's how big they wound up, with a little over a tablespoon size ball, so they're big enough. They'll stay at room temperature in a covered container for a couple of days if they last that long at your house. A bunch of these will go to work with hubby tomorrow, and the rest, most of the rest, will go in the freezer so Mama doesn't eat them all. So, one thing is my downfall, and that is cookies. They are very good cookies if you like peanut butter. And we like peanut butter. Even the dogs like peanut butter. Tasty stuff. I hope you give them a try.